I've been enjoying listening to your album, and I want to hear all about it. But first, can you tell me how do you pronounce that word? Is it
Rapsodya. Rapsodya.
Rapsodya.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it really comes from the second movement of my sonata, and the second movement of that is originally I was thinking that it's a format that I would call Rhapsody, and a lot of the influence, the classical part of what's in that sonata is sort of reminds me very much of sort of Russian influence kind of stuff. So Rachmaninoff or Tchaikovsky or something like that. So I wanted to make it more Rapsodya rather than Rhapsody.
Yeah, and giving it that unusual spelling, make sure that anybody who Googles it will come up with your name first.
I hadn't thought of that, but that's a really good thing to keep in mind for future. That's a good idea.
Yeah. Well, I like your album titles, and of course they come from your songs, and all of your albums up to now have been jazz, but
exactly,
Dogtown and She-Devil and Triceratops. I've actually gone back and listened to some of that because I wanted to see how you reconcile your jazz history with your classical pedigree.
Okay.
Can you just sort of introduce us to you as a musician? I know you started classical really young, and then you made kind of a detour into jazz, but you never really left the classical behind completely. Though.
Exactly, right. I always the classical was really my first, that's what I'm originally that was my identity as a musician for a very long time, until actually it was a mistake. I got put into a jazz composition class, in one of these Saturday Manhattan School prep division, programs I was in, and I signed up for a composition class. Turned out to be jazz, and I kind of thought, well, this is a mistake, and I stayed for the class. And by the end of that class, I just decided I'm going to have to go back next week and just continue this. This is really interesting. They were talking about blues and, the construction of blues compositions, and that's kind of how it all got started with the jazz.
When did you start performing as a jazz musician? Then?
Not really all that soon. I really continued. I was sort of studying the jazz and kind of getting my jazz chops together while continuing with classical and performing classical. And it really wasn't until I finished my master's program in jazz that I really started really professionally gigging, in the jazz world. So that was some years later. It was about 6 years after I first started studying jazz. Although when I got to Ithaca College, I was in the jazz band and, was able to kind of work out my skills during that time as well.
Let's talk about your piano sonata, which this is not new, right? It's been around for a while.
It now has been, yeah. I really composed it in 2006. And it was soon, played. It was performed not by me, but it was performed at this festival in Mexico, and I started performing it as well during my concerts.
What made you want to write the piano sonata and to do it in a mostly classical style?
Yeah, I think it was something that felt to me like it was like something that was just waiting to be born. I mean, it was just something that just felt like there was no question in my mind. The kind of the exact themes didn't come out until that time. When I really started sitting down for long chunks of time to really get it figured out and written down, and it just felt like something that was the natural outgrowth of the fact that I hadn't really composed a lot of classical material up to that point either. As you said, my composing was largely focused in the Latin jazz world, except for projects, in schooling, growing up as far as classical stuff. So I was kind of overdue for a classical composition, and yet I have these jazz harmonies and jazz sensibilities, floating around in my mind at all times. So that kind of had to be integrated, and I really wanted to integrate the two things. And in my mind, I felt like, why hasn't this been done more? Or at least, why haven't I done it up till now? And, it just felt like such a natural thing to kind of fuse these two things together.
Yeah. It's interesting. Somebody who wouldn't necessarily know that you are a jazz musician would hear it right away, especially in the first movement, that this really kind of moves back and forth between, you introduce some little jazz licks here and there.
Exactly. I kind of throw them in.
Yeah.
It's really, in my mind, kind of set in a really classical foundationally, it's a classical backdrop, if you want to, call it that. It's kind of like set on a canvas of classical setting, and it's the jazz elements in it are more, the harmonic some of the harmonic elements and the melodic, like you said, some sort of melodic things that I threw in, and just sort of little riffs here and there that or even passages that are more jazz in nature, but the structure, the real foundation of this is really classical.
You can hear certainly influences here and there, but altogether, taken as a whole, you have your own voice there.
Thank you. That's a huge compliment to me, because that's what I want to do. I don't want it to be, I hope not anyway. You never know how people are going to perceive your music, but
yeah,
I want to feel that it's something that's uniquely mine. I don't want it to be just thought, well, that sounds like, Brahms with some jazz thrown in or something, although I can't help but have influences, from those eras.
But you very smartly included it on an album that has a lot of other composers that are core classical composers, but they all, maybe Beethoven aside, they all represent sort of an element that would feed its way into jazz. You have Debussy, which is certainly harmonically more jazzy. You have Bach.
Right. Bach is really the original jazzer.
Who is in syncopation.
Yeah.
And Chopin, who's sort of improvisation. You've got all these different elements strewn together. That's
true. I never really even thought of it that way, that the Beethoven really has the least in common, you might say, with jazz. That is true.
What led you to include the Beethoven Sonata?
My thought wasn't even, I know it, although we just said that like all these things have elements in common with jazz, although it wasn't really my intention. The point of the collection wasn't to say, okay, what's going to really have jazz elements in it, and to look for the jazz in Bach and Chopin and, and Debussy, in addition to the Beethoven. So in a way, that wasn't even my primary idea, although that's kind of nice if people find that, in this collection. So my idea, so the Beethoven wasn't really, in my mind, a departure from what I set out to do, which was really to, I wanted to offset my sonata with a lot of the music that I have played for many years. That one actually was probably the newest to my repertoire anyway. The Bach and the Ballade, the Chopin Ballade and the Debussy go back a really long time for me.
I love in your notes here, you have a little note that says you think every concert needs a Beethoven piece.
Yeah, I know. It's sort of, that's almost sort of tongue-in-cheek said. But on the other hand, there is some truth to the idea. In my mind, I guess this is just, people may disagree with me or have their own idea of what some of the most pure forms of classical piano music is. But to me, Beethoven is just, it's just the purest expression of classical music. It's, and as much as I am totally driven by, percussive harmonies and, the more interesting harmonic aspects of, you know, the Romantic era, like Chopin and Brahms. You know, Beethoven I feel incomplete in a way without a Beethoven composition at some point. I don't know if it's a conscious thing, but almost all of my programs seem to include that.
Well, you speak of your programs, and this album could easily double for a piano recital.
Yes.
As is. Was that sort of what you were thinking here?
That's exactly, yeah. I really wanted it to be, because this is exactly the type of, I haven't done this exact lineup, you know, but this is something that I wanted it to feel like this is a program that I would put together. It's not a collection of music that's like just meant for, you know, sort of piecemeal listening, although people listen the way they listen. So you're not going to tell everyone they have to sit there and listen to the whole, you know, concert as a program. But I wanted it to be set up that way for that possibility. And for me, this just worked as what would be a listening experience, you know, in its entirety, including the whole thing.
Well, the album is called Rapsodya, and people can find it at all the usual outlets. If folks want to learn a little bit more about you, you have a website they can go to?
I do. It's robertprester.com.
Prester.
Right. And the CD, all my CDs, the easiest way to access them is CD Baby.
All right. I know you have samples on your website, too, if people want to go and listen to little bits and pieces.
Exactly, of all my CDs.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much for your time today, and thanks for joining us here on FM 91.
Thank you very much. Really an honor to talk with you about it.